System recovery. In this nugget, we look at system recovery, which eventually you're going to have to use some version of or another. And there are several methods you can use for system recovery. One of those methods is not really something that is strictly system recovery. It's also used for ongoing file management, and that is volume shadow copy service. And it's a thread that kind of runs through everything we'll be discussing for the remainder of this nugget. VSS is useful for transferring data from live data to a separate location where you can analyze that data or do data mining against it, for example. And although that's not the main focus of VSS for our purposes, certainly it is a useful purpose of it. We do, however, use VSS extensively with our backup processes, and this allows us to back up files, even files that are currently locked open by users. And we'll look at various backup methods and backup types as well. And then we'll take a look at ASR, which is a backup function that you can use to back up the entire system and/or boot partition, and also additional data partitions if you like. And then finally, we'll look at Shadow Copy Restore, which is possibly the best feature of Windows Server 2003, and it allows users to restore their own data instead of recovering from a tape backup and waiting for 2 or 3 days possibly to get that back from an IT department. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS as many people call it. It's useful for 3 things: data transport, shadow copy restore, and backup. These bottom 2 items we'll be discussing a little bit more in this nugget, but let's just briefly discuss also data transport. Let's say that you have a SQL database that processes hundreds of transactions per second. Well, it's probably a pretty busy database. And if you also have to do data mining on that same database, you don't want to do those simultaneously, because doing so would adversely affect performance. So what you could do is use the Volume Shadow Copy service to offload the data itself onto a separate hard disk and run your queries for data mining against the data on that separate hard disk, thereby not affecting the performance of the source data on the original disk. And the original data on the source drive remains dynamic, and users can continue to read and write to it, while this static data is where you can perform your queries on the separate hard drive. And then the Shadow Copy Restore is very useful for when users accidentally delete their files, save the wrong version of a file, or the system corrupts a file, and then the user calls up the IT department and says, "Hey, I need you to restore my file from tape backup." Well, that's really easy for them to say, but it might take you a couple of days or so to retrieve all that from a tape backup because of the process that's involved, and somehow the users aren't quite satisfied with a couple of day restore time. Well, with VSS, what happens is an automatic backup is made of that data at periodic intervals, and the user using Windows Explorer can restore that data themselves without even calling the IT department. It's very easy to do. And then if they do have to use tape backup, there's typically been a problem in the past because when administrators back up files that users have currently open, the backup utility can't back up those open files because they're locked open. Well, now with VSS, it will create a copy of even those open files, and then the backup utility actually backs up those open files from the shadow copy. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at how the Volume Shadow service works with the backup utility. Now, this again is not new with Windows Server 2003. There are still proprietary methods out there. I do predict that many vendors will work with the Volume Shadow Copy service to use it instead of their own proprietary methods, or at least to offer VSS as an option when backing up data. The first thing that happens is the backup utility, through using VSS, will tell VSS to freeze the application that has a file open. And of course, this is so that that application cannot make writes to the actual file that's in use at the time of the freeze. What will also happen is the application will create buffer space so that it can handle any inbound requests that are coming from the application to change that data. That way, any changes are not lost. They're retained in the buffer, and then later on, when I show you, they will be flushed out. Then what happens is the backup utility will create a backup of, or a shadow copy of, that same data. So this will be copied down here, and I'll just exit, meaning that's a shadow copy version of that live data. At which point, when the thaw takes place after this has been made, then the application will flush out whatever was in the buffer space back into the actual live file. And then it's available for use to the user as usual. And all of this takes just a brief moment of time. There's hardly anything noticeable. Your users will probably not notice this for the most part. And then finally, the NT backup utility will back up that volume shadow copy shadow of the data. And of course, any files that were not open, it just backs up as usual. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use the volume shadow copy service in conjunction with the backup utility. Here I've got a file open, and this is the type of a file that a user might leave open all day long. It just keeps a record of who I talk to because maybe I'm on the phone a lot. So I don't usually close this because I know I'll just have to open it up again in a few minutes. Now, the administrator wants to make a backup of this data, so they'll go to All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, and Backup. Once we get to backup, we'll see there's some buttons here at the front for a backup wizard for backup and restore, as well as an ASR wizard, which we'll address later on. Then we'll go to the backup tab here to manually create the backup of the specific file that I have open, and I just went ahead and marked it using a checkbox here. Then I'll enter in a file name and specify on drive F in this case. Doesn't matter where you put it, you just got to put it somewhere. If you have a tape backup attached, you'll also see a backup destination for that specific tape. Once you've made your appropriate selections, just click on the Start Backup button, give it a user-friendly backup description so that you can identify the backup, and then if you're going to overwrite the existing data, you can also give a different label to identify that media. You can also replace the data as well. If you replace the data, I also recommend that you check this box, which is to allow only the owner and the administrator access to the backup data. That way, if the data falls into the wrong hands, no one else can access it. In addition to simply starting the backup now, you can also schedule the backup, which works in conjunction with Scheduled Tasks in Windows Server 2003, and it interfaces with the Scheduled Jobs item here in the background that allows you to see jobs on a calendar. Then we can click on the Advanced button, which will allow us to back up data that's in remote storage. And remote storage is simply data that's older, that's been offloaded onto less expensive tape libraries. The system will see them as actual drive space, whereas in reality its physical media is tape drives. I think this probably hasn't been used as much as Microsoft thought it would because of the low price of actual hard drives these days. Then we can also verify the data after a backup. Never a bad idea. In fact, usually you should probably check that item. And then, if possible, compress the backup. This only works if you have a tape drive that's compatible with compression. Then you can also automatically back up system protected files with the system state. Since I'm not doing a system state, this checkbox is unavailable, but the system protected files are all the files within the system root, and then you can disable the volume shadow copy. Although I can't think of a good reason to do that right offhand. And then we have various backup types, and I will describe these to you a little bit later on. For the time being, we'll simply do a normal backup and click OK to start the backup. We'll see that I already had a backup there previously, and it asked me if I wanted to overwrite it there. I simply clicked on yes, and now it's going to go ahead and back it up. It prepares to do the backup using the Volume Shadow Copy service, and it gives us a summary here at the end, and we can also click on the report to verify that it backed up a directory and a file. If we had not used the Volume Shadow Copy service and we had selected the checkbox under the advanced options, that file would not have been backed up. Let's briefly address the backup types that we saw in the advanced options for the NT Backup utility. You might be familiar with a lot of these from previous experience with NT Backup or from other backup software. They pretty much work across the board the same way. What happens with a normal backup, and let's say we do a normal backup on Monday, is that it will back up all the files and it clears the archive bit. With that archive bit cleared, that means that it has been backed up, so that when we come back on Tuesday to perform an incremental backup, it doesn't back up any files that have not changed or are not new since Monday. It only does new or changed files because those files will now have an archive bit. The same is true of Wednesday, and it will back up any new or changed file since Tuesday or since the last full normal backup. And the same thing is true of Thursday and Friday as well. Now, the advantage for the incremental backup is that this uses very little space, so it's inexpensive. The disadvantage is it can take potentially a long time to recover data. For example, let's say you have a user that says they need a restored file from the Thursday night's backup. Well, since these are done incrementally, we need to supply tapes from Thursday plus Wednesday plus Tuesday plus Monday to recover the data for even the one file on that Thursday backup, because these are all done in series. Now, also remember that the incremental and the normal do an archive bit. They clear the archive bit when they do their backups. Now, if that's not the desired behavior for you to go through all these tapes when you want to restore a file, you can consider doing a differential instead. With a differential, it does the backup, but it does not mark the archive bit. So then, on Tuesday, it sees any files that are new or changed, and it does the backup, and it doesn't clear any archive bit. Therefore, on Wednesday, it has both the Tuesdays changes plus Wednesday's changes since no archive bits were cleared. Then on Thursday, it does Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and then Friday, of course, would be all 4 days all the way through here because no archive bits were ever cleared. Therefore, it sees all the changes since our last normal backup. And this also means that in this case, if I want to recover a file from the Thursday backup here, then I only need to supply the Thursday backup and the Monday backup, and it's much less taxing in terms of time, although obviously this will use more space per backup. Now if I use backup to do a copy, what it does is it will back up any files that I select, except that it will not clear the archive bit. And this can be useful in backing up somewhere between my normal and my incremental backups here. Let's say I do a copy right here, and that way it will not affect my next incremental backup because it never cleared an archive bit. Therefore, Wednesday's incremental will still look for the archive bit properly. And then, of course, the daily backup is just that. It only backs up any files that are new or changed on the day you make the backup. Of course, it's also critical that we secure the backups that we create. I recommend that you very carefully check out who you want to be backup operators and keep track of what they do. It might also be important to see how often they use their privileges, and you can audit against that and see how often backup operators use the privileges to create a backup. You might want to see if they're creating backups outside of their assigned schedule, for example, and see if they're creating restores that they're not supposed to be able to create as well. Then also make sure that you check that box in the backup, which we saw earlier, that allows only the owner or the administrator to read from the backup. And that, of course, just is an obvious level of protection. Also, as with most of our administrative functions that we run, we want to use run as possible so that if you're creating a backup, you're logged on as just a Joe user with the domain user privileges, and then you right-click on the backup utility on the start menu and choose run as, and then enter in administrative credentials there. And that protects not really the backup so much, but your normal desktop from potential of being hijacked by somebody else, by a passerby while you're at the water fountain or so on and so forth. And then we will, of course, want to physically secure the tapes as well. Even if you take these other measures to protect the tape, the physical security is possibly the most important because as long as someone has the time and the determination, if they can physically grab a tape, take it home or somewhere else, they eventually will be able to derive information out of it, even if you've only allowed the owner administrator access to it. Well, let's take a look at Automated System Recovery, which is not to be confused with Windows XP's System Restore. XP's System Restore is point-in-time backups of certain components of the operating system, such as user profiles, the registry, system files, and the like. And these backups take place manually if you want to. You can manually create one, but otherwise it will take place automatically at certain points in time, such as when you install new drivers or new applications. And then you can effectively roll back Windows XP to a previous version of the operating system if something's gone wrong with, let's say, a new application or some other system problem. Well, ASR is not automated that way because you do have to do it manually, so it's kind of strange. I'm not sure what's automated about the Automated System Restore because you manually do the backup of the system and boot partitions using one of two wizards. The first one is the Automated System Recovery Wizard, which you can do when you do backups without the initial backup or restore wizard. And when using that wizard, which again is the Automated System Recovery Wizard, it only backs up the system and boot partitions, and then it contains information about various volumes that you also have on the disks. And that information will be stored on a floppy disk, which you'll need to supply by the time the wizard completes. The other kind of wizard you can use is the Backup or Restore Wizard, which can back up all data on the entire machine, including all volumes. And, of course, that would then include the system and boot partition in the Automated System Recovery Wizard. And I'll show you the differences between those as we go. Let's go ahead and explore how you would actually create an ASR backup. And you'll do this by using the backup utility on Start, All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, and Backup, just like we looked at earlier. Now, the default behavior for backup is to always start in the wizard mode, and we'll just use that for the time being to click on Next, where we'll back up all files and settings, and then Next. Now, since this is all information on the computer, you'll see that this is the more comprehensive version for doing an ASR backup. Now, you could do this if you wanted just the data, but it would also include with it ASR data, just in case you have a complete system failure that you need to recover from. But given that this is the more comprehensive kind, it will also include all the data on all the volumes on the local machine. And then this could be quite large, so make sure you put it in a location that can store this data, whether it's another drive here or whether you're going to be able to put it on tape as well. And then just name it, then next and finish. Now, once I've clicked on finish here, it'll take a good while to back up several gigabytes of data. And I'm not going to actually click on finish to do that in our current purposes because of interest of time. But once you do this, it will then prompt you for a floppy disk. Now, the floppy disk will contain all of the information about all the volumes, what kind of volumes they are. It includes their globally unique identifiers, all different kinds of things about those partitions. And then when you create a restore and actually restore this information to another machine that perhaps you've rebuilt because the original one blew up, then you need to use disks that are the same size as the original or larger disks than the original. And if you don't, then the ASR recovery will fail. Now, returning to backup here, I could also go to advanced mode. And going to advanced mode, there's an automated system recovery wizard here. And by clicking this button, instead of using the previous wizard that I showed you, it will only create a backup of the system boot volumes. Now, this is mostly the same wizard, except that it's not going to also include the data that we have on additional volumes on the same computer. So then, of course, you'll just name the backup again as usual and then click on Finish again, at which point you'll have to provide a floppy disk again, which provides the same information that we discussed earlier. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how we would restore from ASR after we've made that backup. Now, when it comes time to actually restore your ASR backup, first just make sure that your ASR backup is available and that your tape is in the drive. Then what you can do is to insert the floppy, because that's going to contain all the disk information for all your local volumes. Then what you'll do is to boot from the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM. Earlier in that boot process, it will give you a message that says press F2 to start the automated system recovery. Then it will reconfigure your drives, which basically means delete everything and rebuild them based upon what the information is that's on this floppy disk. Then it will copy the files from the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM as it would during a normal installation in the text mode phase. Then it reboots into the GUI mode phase where it continues to copy more files, and it will then restore the files from the tape. After it restores the files from the tape and reboots, you basically have the exact same machine that you did when you first configured the ASR backup. Well, undoubtedly, one of the best features of Windows Server 2003 is Shadow Copy Restore, which uses the VSS service to perform its function. Users are often embarrassed when they have to call the IT department and say, oh, I was stupid, I made a dumb mistake, I deleted a file, or I made some changes in a file I didn't want to actually keep, and when I closed Microsoft Word, it gives me that yes, no, cancel thing. Well, just reflexively, I clicked on yes. What can you do to help me? Can you restore this file from tape for me? Well, it's easy for them to say, can you restore the file from tape, but it's hard for you to actually do because the users don't actually realize what all is involved in that. First of all, let's take a look at some interesting numbers with this. Microsoft estimates that 34% of file problems are as a result of user error. That sounds about right, or possibly a little bit low. Maybe it's actually higher than that. And when users make those mistakes, they have to call the IT department to restore the files from tape. Now, at Microsoft, in their IT department, if a user calls to restore from tape, then it requires 3 escalations through the IT hierarchy to get that file restored. In that process, it takes about 24 to 72 hours to fully restore that file. And somehow users are never happy with that length of time. And then it costs about $300 to restore that file from tape. Now, I'm not slamming Microsoft with these numbers at all. That Microsoft runs a very good IT department. It's just that they're a large organization with tens of thousands of desktops. And of course, it's going to take a while to get all this kind of stuff done. Well, with the Shadow Copy Restore, users don't have to call the IT department to admit their user error because they can restore it themselves once they learn how to use Shadow Copy, and it's very easy. And they don't have to escalate this to the IT department and consume considerable resources out of IT department's time. And they don't have to wait so long to get this back anymore. Now, using Shadow Copy Restore, it takes only seconds to get their file back. And also, they will no longer have to cost the company $300. By the way, I have another personal theory. I'll bet that instead of it costing the company $300 to restore from tape, if you would just charge users back $300 against their paychecks whenever they make a careless deletion, I'll bet you'd get a lot fewer careless deletions. But that's kind of harsh, isn't it? Now, maybe those statistics that I showed from Microsoft don't apply to your organization. Maybe you can restore things faster than 24 to 72 hours. But regardless, you know that it's always a hassle anytime you have to do that from tape backup. So using a volume shadow copy, we can right-click on My Computer, choose Manage, And then once you get here, you'll go to the Shares item, Shared Folders, right-click here, choose All Tasks to configure shadow copies. Now, we can get to this same tab here for shadow copies by right-clicking on any of these local volumes and choosing Properties, and this same Shadow Copies tab appears for all the volumes. Then it shows you whether or not it's enabled for your volume shadow copy. They're all disabled by default. How many shares are available? There are 4 of them, and if you remember on my D drive, which I'm doing this for, I actually have 3 shares there, so where's the 4th one? Well, don't forget we have an administrative share at $, so it sees 4 shares there. Now, it's tempting to go ahead and click on Enable right now, and if we do that, then we click Yes to a prompt which will appear, it will create its first shadow copy, but we don't get any options for that. So it's important to click on Settings first, because if you actually want to store this on a different volume, you have to click Settings first and then enable the Volume Shadow Copy service. So let's go ahead and click on Settings, and here's what you want to really look at. You want to specify which volume you want to store the Volume Shadow Copy service on. Now, D is one physical drive, G is another physical drive, and I would rather store it on G so that I don't burden the first drive where I actually have my live data at work. And then, of course, I'll specify whether I want no limit, at which point it can store up to 64 Volume Shadow Copy copies, at which point if I store a 65th version, it will delete the oldest version on a FIFO basis, first in, first out. Or by default, I can use a limit. And you have to have at least 100 megabytes of free space in order to create at least one shadow copy. And then you can click on Details to look at detailed information about the storage volume that you're about to use. It tells you how much disk space is free and how much total disk space there is available. Within the schedule, we can adjust our default values of every 7 o'clock on every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or every weekday, or 12 o'clock of every weekday as well. For example, if you also have people working on weekends and you want to create backups then you might check these additional boxes here. If you want to add an additional period of time, maybe every day at 5 p.m., you could do that as well. So I might make this 5 o'clock p.m. every day. And this is pretty easy to use. You just specify whether you want it scheduled every day, every other day. You know, if you have the advanced button here, you can specify a specific end date when you want it to end. This is very similar to what we have for scheduled tasks, so you've probably used that before. You can repeat the task every specific period of time if you want to do it in terms of minutes or instead of every few hours, for example. By the way, you don't want to do this more than every hour because the burden is probably just too intensive on the disk. So once we've got all of our settings configured the way we want to, then we can go ahead and click Enable. It will then prompt you with this message which asks that you are about to create shadow copies, and initially it will use the default schedule and ask if you want to enable them. You go ahead and click on Yes if you like. One thing to keep in mind here again is that they do have high I/O when you go ahead and use the default settings here. So that's again why you want to place them on a different volume whenever possible. And this should be a different physical volume, not just a different partition on the same disk. So we'll go ahead and click on Yes here and let the shadow copy create. It will go ahead and create its first one, and I'll see you on the other side of this. Now, after it's made its first volume shadow copy, we'll see that it's scheduled, where you can see the little clock there, to run some more. The next one's going to be at 12 o'clock p.m. And if we go to Settings, we see that it's located on drive G as I specified. Now, here's the big reason why it's important to choose the settings before you enable Volume Shadow Copy. If I realized I chose the same volume and I put the storage area on the same volume accidentally, I can't change it here. What I would have to do is to disable this item, go back to Settings, make the settings for the appropriate drive, and then click Enable again. And in the process, when you disable this, you'll lose all the shadow copies that you had created. They're all deleted. And of course, if I want to, I can always create now and create an additional point-in-time backup of the shadow copies. Now let's go ahead and take a look at an example of how even I might be able to use this service. For example, remember this slide that I was using just a little while ago? Well, I was using this slide and I was making markups on all this. I was checkboxing stuff, and then I was scratching stuff out, and then I was charging users $300 and all that kind of stuff. Well, once I'm done with all that kind of thing, I don't want to save all these red marks in there. I just want to keep this little black text in the background on here. So when I click Close, if I'm not thinking, I might just reflexively click on Yes. Oh, crud, what did I just do? I saved all those red marks on there. That's not what I want to do, for crying out loud. And then I might say a few other words that are not fit to record. So anyway, how do I get this back? Well, you can do this through Windows Explorer. Now, I'm actually seated at the local server where that share is located, but it is a mistake to click on the drive where the share is located, and then to click on the share, and then just to right-click on the file that I want to restore and choose Properties, because otherwise, there would be a previous versions tab here that I don't see right now. And the reason I don't is because I'm on the local file system where I have to be using the Common Internet File System, or CIFS, to be able to access it. To use CIFS, you simply go through a UNC path, then I can right-click on the file that I want to restore and choose Properties, and now we see a Previous Versions tab. Now, the shadow copy that we have here will not appear if it's no different than the current version that I already have. So I know I'm encouraged to see that there's something there, because that means I do have a previous version that could work. I can also double check it by clicking on View, which opens it in its native application. I say, oh, hooray, there's the one I want. It's not got those little red marks on there. And then if I want to double check it, I can also copy it to a separate location and just browse for a different location if you want. And that way I might be able to compare the two documents next to each other if it's a complicated document that requires a little bit more investigation. And then I can also just simply click Restore, which is what I'm going to do right now. And this prompt says, are you sure you want to roll back to the previous version? And I say yes. It successfully restores it. So now I'll go ahead and go to my application, open up that file, if I can use my own menu system here, and then we see we've got our previous version without all the red marks on it. Let's make a couple of more notes about the Volume Shadow Copy service. First of all, where does it actually go? We specified drive G, but there's no folder there that says Volume Shadow Copy or something like that. Well, it's actually stored in the system volume information, which even administrators are forbidden to access, and that helps to protect that data and other critical information about the system within that folder. And the actual files in the Volume Shadow Copy are also read-only, so that if you want to view the file, you can't make any changes to it. It's only for viewing, and it does not give you the ability to edit that file until you restore it. And if you had the ability to edit it in its original format, then you can edit it after you restore it as well. And also, you may have guessed this by the way we originally configured our shadow copies, but you cannot configure a shadow copy for individual shares on a drive. You have to do it for the entire volume at once, which will include all of the shares on that volume. Also, by default, when we create a Volume Shadow copy, it stores up to 10% of the available hard drive space for Volume Shadow copies. We saw that we can change that, but 10% of the allocated space for Microsoft servers in their initial pilot allows them to have about 2 weeks of recovery. Now, that's just for Microsoft. Your results will vary drastically depending on the amount of available hard drive space you have, and you're going to have to kind of feel this out as you go to determine if you have enough hard drive space to support the needs you want. Also, if you have a very high-speed storage area network, or SAN, and you have large amounts of data, you can create shadow copies pretty quickly on that high-production server with that high-speed storage array. Microsoft says that for their terabyte database, SQL database, it takes them about 35-40 seconds to create the shadow copy, and a little bit longer than that to restore something from it if necessary. Now, you might recall that I said earlier that with Windows Server 2003, it's already built into Windows Explorer the capability to use the previous versions tab. However, if you're using any other client, such as Windows XP or 2000, and you go to a share and you right-click on something where you're supposed to have Volume Shadow Copy enabled, and you click on the properties of it, you don't see anything like we see here. That's because we have to have a previous versions client installed. And here I've switched over to my Windows Server 2003 server, and you look at the file path here, it's under the system root, System32 clients, TW client, x86 for my x86 machines. There's also IA64 for 64-bit machines and AMD machines as well. And then here's my TWCLI32.msi file. Of course, I can use group policy or SMS to publish or assign this application so that my clients can gain access to it. Once I've got this, all I have to do is to install it, and then my clients will be able to use the previous versions tab within Windows Explorer. Let's go ahead and go back to our Windows XP machine and run that file. And here I've returned to Windows XP, and I'll just UNC to a location where I've copied that file. I've just copied it to the public folder because I know everybody has access to that. So I'll just go ahead and double-click on the TWCLI32 item to install the previous versions client. Once it's installed it, I'll go ahead and click on Finish. And from this point on, I should be able to right-click on a file and choose the previous versions. And so let's test this out. We just go to any file here that we know is a part of our volume shadow copy, choose Properties, and indeed there's a Previous Versions tab. Doesn't list anything here, of course, because I haven't made any changes since the previous version's backup was made. But at least I have the tab available now, and I can restore from it if I need to. In this nugget, we looked at system recovery, and specifically at the volume shadow copy service, which is kind of an ongoing thread through everything we looked at here. One of the purposes for VSS is so that you can either transport data to another location to do something like data mining against it, or you can use it with the backup utility, which I'll address here, or you can also use it for shadow copy restore, which is something else that we also discussed in this nugget. As for backup, it allows you to back up files even that users have locked open. And in the past, you would have just had to skip those files or ask the user to close those files. And then using ASR, which is Automated System Recovery, you can back up the entire system and or boot partition, as well as data if you specify that using the backup or restore wizard. And whichever wizard you decide to use with ASR, it still uses the volume shadow copy service to allow you to back up open files. And then we looked at shadow copy restore, which undoubtedly is one of the best features of Windows Server 2003, and it allows users to restore their own data rather than having to ask the IT department to recover it from a tape backup. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.